Thank you for coming. My name is Carlos Diaz. I'm the founding director of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to this event. We're going to be talking, of course, about Orlando's book. I want to introduce him in a second. We're going to get the chance to hear directly from him. But before we do that, we're going to get some commentary about his book. And so rather than introduce each of our speakers in what I think is important about them, I'm going to let them introduce themselves and speak for about 5 minutes about their thoughts on the book. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to ask Orlando to say a few words about the book. The event will be mostly in English, but I think there will be a couple of comments in Spanish as well. You can ask the questions in Spanish or in English.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. My presentation is in Spanish. Quiero darles la bienvenida a todos, agradecerles que estén acompañándonos. Quiero empezar por agradecer especialmente al director del Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, de la FIU, a Carlos, por la amabilidad de recibirnos esta noche en esta prestigiosa institución para darle marco a este evento. Vaya desde la institución que yo integro, que es CESCOS, que está aquí, nuestro agradecimiento y nuestro reconocimiento a esta labor que llevan adelante en el centro. Compartimos con Carlos la pasión por la libertad y el convencimiento de luchar por ella, en este caso desde esta trinchera académica. Saludo también al profesor Julio Shiling. Me honra compartir este panel con usted. Quería decirlo, especialmente. En segundo lugar, decirles que para mí es un privilegio estar esta noche con ustedes. Representar a CESCOS es un privilegio en este evento y la oportunidad de hacer algunos breves aportes acerca de la obra de Orlando Gutiérrez. Es un privilegio también, y que agradezco, contar con la amistad de Orlando, a quien sinceramente, junto con el profesor Shiling, seguramente sean de las personas que más conocen la historia política, la historia con mayúscula de Cuba, así como de las características del régimen que la oprime y agobia desde hace tanto tiempo. Este régimen que es un régimen de oprobio, que es una vergüenza para América Latina y para el mundo. Pero no solo ese saber del que tengo la suerte de alimentarme en el trabajo que compartimos casi cotidianamente, tengo la suerte también de colaborar en el Directorio y en la Asamblea de la Resistencia, sino también la admiración que me provoca su compromiso y convicción que pone al servicio de su proyecto de vida, que es la libertad de Cuba. Y por eso, en alguna medida, estamos aquí. Dicho estas breves palabras, me atrevo a hacer algunos comentarios. Yo, por no vivir de cerca la historia de Cuba, tengo más para aprender que para aportar. No obstante, me voy a permitir decir 2 o 3 breves comentarios acerca del libro y en general de la situación. En primer lugar, destacar la importancia y actualidad de un trabajo diagnóstico de lo que son los totalitarismos a partir del análisis exhaustivo de uno de ellos. Cómo opera, cómo organiza sus engaños, cómo reprime, cómo vuelve a las personas casi objetos de su utopía, cómo adormece la razón del pueblo, haciendo que éste tolere hambre, violencia, persecución y falta de libertad por 4 generaciones, más de 60 años ya. Pero también cómo logra la tolerancia y el apoyo no solo de regímenes similares, más o menos autoritarios, sino también de democracias consolidadas que se precian de tener claros los valores morales de Occidente. Estos apoyos son despreciables y quienes los hacen harían bien en leer este libro para saber a qué y qué están apoyando, a quién y a qué están apoyando. Justamente esto es lo que vuelve a Cuba la doctrina de la mentira una lectura imprescindible. En momentos donde Occidente vive una tentación autoritaria peligrosamente extendida en medio de una creciente crispación social y una insatisfacción que se manifiesta desde la escasez que muchos pueblos, en particular de América Latina, viven, pero también desde la abundancia, en otros casos, un recordatorio de lo que esa tentación autoritaria puede provocar, no a partir de historias anteriores, sino a partir de vivencias cotidianas y que suceden a la vista de nuestros ojos, tiene una importancia vital en este momento. Cuba no sucedió, sigue sucediendo todos los días y nos debería avergonzar todos los días. En segundo lugar, para quienes hemos tenido la dicha de vivir en libertad toda nuestra vida, como saben algunos que me conocen, yo vengo de Uruguay, recientemente me he afincado aquí, una de las democracias más sólidas del continente, por suerte, En este momento, como dije, estoy afincado aquí en esta tierra que ha sido siempre la luz de la libertad y oportunidades de y para Occidente en su conjunto. Nos es difícil muchas veces entender la magnitud del ahogo que provoca no tener libertad. Esa dificultad de entendimiento se expresa incluso en ámbitos académicos, incluso en esta misma casa, donde se comete o se cometió la temeridad de llamar privilegiados a quienes dolorosamente han tenido que escapar de una tiranía infame en busca de libertad, dejando todo atrás, incluso la propia vida en muchos casos. Como si la búsqueda de la libertad fuera la búsqueda de un privilegio. La libertad es inherente al ser humano y es un derecho de todos. Quienes desesperadamente dejan todo atrás para recuperarla, no buscan privilegios, buscan libertad, ni más ni menos. Esa libertad que hemos tenido siempre en estas tierras y con las que se construye todo lo demás de la vida humana. La pérdida de esas libertades básicas que describe Cuba, la doctrina de la mentira. Así que para nosotros, pero también para ellos, es imprescindible la lectura de este libro. En tercer y último lugar, la obra tiene la virtud de desnudar al régimen en toda su dimensión totalitaria, combatiendo con las mejores herramientas, que son la rigurosidad teórica y el análisis erudito, al relato que a lo largo de los años se ha venido construyendo por parte del régimen y sus colaboradores. Son necesarias obras como esta, porque de lo contrario terminamos confundiendo el debate válido y constructivo acerca de determinados principios entre ideas más conservadoras versus otras más sociales o más socialdemócratas que dan al Estado un rol más presente en determinadas circunstancias que en otras. Pero esos debates siempre deben ser respetando los valores democráticos y en un contexto de total libertad de expresión. Para decirlo más claro, no debemos confundir el régimen tirano que existe en Cuba con un modelo de base más social. Cuba está bajo un régimen totalitario oprobioso y no hay nada en él que lo engrandezca ni que deba ser tomado como ejemplo. Por eso es tan importante también, en este caso, la obra de Orlando. Por último, ahora sí, para no entenderme más y escuchar a quienes realmente tienen cosas más importantes que aportar, una breve nota sobre el autor. Orlando, como la mayoría de ustedes saben, es un comprometido activista que ha dedicado y dedica su vida con orgullo y como ya dije, con admirable convicción para darle un camino de libertad a su patria. Son pocos los autores que pueden comprometerse con tal fortaleza con la causa que defienden, así como con el lector, para construir una obra de análisis sereno pero contundente. Orlando, además, es uno de esos pocos privilegiados que con su formidable conocimiento del pasado, con una vibrante vivencia del presente, construye un futuro posible y concreto. Nosotros podemos disfrutar de esa combinación que, por cierto, no es nada común. Agrego, finalmente, que quienes tenemos la suerte de conocerle podemos atestiguar su gran dimensión humana y su generosidad. Lo conozco desde hace varios años a partir de un gran amigo en común, pero particularmente en este último año que estoy viviendo aquí, he recibido de Orlando siempre las oportunidades, como la de estar haciendo aquí estos comentarios que seguramente no merezco, y el consejo siempre oportuno y mesurado. Me ha contagiado a luchar a su lado y que tanto con esta obra como con su prédica diaria es un ejemplo de compromiso y dedicación. Gracias, Orlando, felicitaciones por este trabajo y los convoco a todos a leerlo sin falta.
Gracias.
Julio.
Yo voy a hablar en inglés, pero primero, ¿verdad? Las gracias. Mira, el placer es todo mío. Instituciones como CESCOS dan fortaleza y desmienten esa noción que los cubanos por muchos años dijimos estamos solos. Y realmente personas como tú están en una posición y en una trinchera valiosísima y se te agradece enormemente la lucha que llevas a cabo.
Muchas gracias.
All right, I'm going to switch to English. It's a pleasure to be here for many reasons. FIU is our alma mater. Even though Orlando also went to UM, I know he has a special place for FIU. We took classes together, political science classes together. But actually, we know each other from before then. We know each other from a Cuban Freedom Youth Woodstock, which was the formation of what later came to be el Directorio. This was a couple of days of interacting, you know, from all spectrums of the political field. There were no drugs, but there was plenty of love and commitment to a free Cuba. And so many friends, you know, from there, we still keep in touch, and whenever we see each other, that is a special time that we'll always remember. When you get a book, you always sort of like a trailer in a movie, you know, you sort of like preview, say, oh, you know, am I gonna like this or not? I gotta read it, right? I mean, I can't talk about it and not read it. Then I see Gnosticism. I said, I may like this. And then I see Eric Voegelin, who, you know, one of my intellectual heroes. I said, I'm gonna really like this. Then I see Hannah Arendt, and I said, that's it. This is for me. So I enjoyed reading it. I mean, I'm so glad we're on the same, you know, moral framework, because I really, really enjoyed it. It's a major contribution into social scientific literature. I am so pleased that you touched upon the notion that distinguishes a regime of total domination, a totalitarian regime, because enemies of liberty want us to believe that that is Cold War language and Cold War rhetoric. I mean, these are the same people that are telling us, you know, Cuba is no longer communist, or North Korea, or, you know, China is no longer communist. So it's important that you touched upon that, because totalitarianism isn't an ideology, but it is a modus operandi. And it's very effective, unfortunately. It has an ideology, whether you want to categorize it as a belief system or an official discourse to advance in the system, it's irrelevant. It does have an abiding ideology. You have a dominant party that isn't a party in the sense of traditional that we know in the free world. It's a machinery, a war machinery to stay in power. And there's control of the media, of economic activity, and all the social institutions, which means that there's a parallel civil society that's not really civil society, it's a fake civil society. And all this depends upon fabrications and falsehoods. Hannah Arendt described it beautifully. She said, power as conceived by totalitarianism lies exclusively in the force produced through organization. In other words, nothing happens by chance. I mean, when you see a system that is operating and is able to stay in power for 64 years, like in the Cuban case, this hasn't happened, you know, out of hap chance. There's been a structural organization that, unfortunately, and I'm so glad Orlando touched upon this, would not be possible if it were not for the complicity of the West, whether that be overt, tacit, or by ignorance or naivety. But that organization of political power and society contains among its ingredients mass mobilizations. In other words, the ability of the regime to mobilize the masses, to give the impression, because this is part of the sideshow, it's part of the big lie, that this is all spontaneous activity. In other words, that this is the people responding because they need to give the impression constantly. This is like a constant theatrics. They need to give the impression that they have the support of the people. So they go in a public forum and they utilize all of the state's resources to do that. I mean, we saw this in the, you know, we always see it, but it was so evident in the Cuban July 11th uprising, where they mobilized, you know, you had these terror groups disguised as civilians, used to repress the people, and this is how they operate. Now, why would they do that? Well, Iran does the same thing, China does the same thing. They do this because they want to give the impression that this is the people against a small sector, which is, you know, it was totally, obviously not the case in July 11th. But Juan Linz, Alfred Stepan, political scientists have argued about the importance of mass mobilization in regimes of totalitarian structures. The notion of a counterculture, which breeds like a totalitarian culture, requires a whole host of mechanisms that, Orlando puts it very, very, you know, easy to understand. And I'm glad he wrote it that way, probably instead of how I'm explaining it. But and that is that you need lies based on the past, based on the present, and based on the future. It's all a Potemkin village that's designed for the inner population to believe that they're invincible, but also, and probably more to the fact, the outside world, to give an image of what they are not. And again, this never stops. I mean, they never reach a point where they say, okay, we're in power, we can, just let things be. No, this is constantly. It's recruiting spies. It's infiltrating institutions in the West. It's constant. This is Madison Avenue more so than any capitalist business would do to promote an image. Some of the methodological instruments, critical theory. Disinformation. Lieutenant General Ion Pesepa, a high security, a high-level Romanian intelligence officer, one of the highest in defect, said that the Soviet Union spent more on disinformation than in any other aspect of their foreign espionage. Disinformation contains always a bit of truth, and that's why it's so successful. It's what Ana Belén did, for example, Ana Belén Montes. It's what the State Department did when Batista's regime was in power. They present false data and information to sway, in this case, the American government, into having a vision that isn't the truth, but it's what they need to happen to be able to promote their subversive mechanism. So this is, disinformation is probably, and we see this constantly, a notion which was developed by Jean-Francois Lyotard, legitimation by paralogy. What this basically does is you have a second set of ideas. They don't have to be true, but you get enough people to echo it, and then it's legitimated by that false parody. The radical left does this tremendously. Idea laundering. I mean, think of money laundering. Well, idea laundering is the exact same thing. They take false ideas, and it's passed through pseudo-academic journals and institutes with articles that are saying bizarre things that couldn't pass the test of scrutiny. I think the professor from Massachusetts arguing on the regime's behalf on the false nature of why Cubans immigrate is an example of idea laundering. She's taking totally false facts, false information. She's not substantiating her work, yet it has acceptability from peers. Well, that's idea laundering in action. You chose, and I think, what a choice. It's like having, perfect wine over dinner. You chose Ernesto Che Guevara as part of that myth-building lie that's been perpetrated. And in fact, Lieutenant General Paceta identifies him and the publication of a lot of his work as having been engineered in Moscow with Fidel Castro precisely to build that narrative. I mean, they saw in him the possibility of having a romantic-looking figure and a setting, sort of like a Mickey Mouse, from Marxism. So, none of these things are spontaneous. This is all worked at and thought over, and if nobody challenges this, then you have the legitimation by paralogy. It's there. And you chose the falsely named agrarian reform, by the regime, the INRA, which was absolutely used to, in effect, communize Cuba. It was the first mechanism where they weaponized the system. This was a deliberate attempt. This had nothing to do with, bringing about more equity or, greater distribution of wealth. Nothing at all. It had no economic sense, rationalization whatsoever. But it did have the ability to render a civil society decapitated and take full power. So the fact that you touched on that, Orlando, I think It's wonderful because sometimes if you leave it too general, you know, there's just so much terrain to cover, and you could miss the big picture. So I'm really glad you chose to focus specifically on that. And folks, Antonio Gramsci was right. No, I'm not going to make a Marxist apologia. He was right in signaling out the intellectual and the importance that it has in dictating and influencing public policy. And intellectuals have a duty. This is why institutions like CESCOS, like the Adam Smith Foundation, are so important because you are challenging radical ideas that enemies of liberty promote from an angle of rationalization and intellectual base, because the truth is, most of their positions, it's ideas that are laundered, they're legitimated by a false plurality. There's a false simulation of what is real, and this has to be challenged. In the case of Cuba, it's, you know, having more doctors per capita than Belgium, France. You know, this is a fact. This is an irrefutable fact. You cannot say that that is not the case. Yet the regime has managed, unfortunately, in many circles, to convince people that that is the case. And you would think that intellectuals would, you know better and say, well, wait a minute. Where was this other country in 1958? And where was Cuba? Okay, and where is this other country now, and where's Cuba? And sort of say, well, wait a minute. They didn't need this brutal regime to, you know, bring up what? 16 points the literacy rate, you see? So, in conclusion, I think that, and I'm encouraged, Orlando, by your work, and I think that this is where we need to go. And I just want to close by saying something that Oriana Fallaci said. She's got a lot of great quotes. The moment you give up your principles and your values, you are dead. Your culture is dead. Your civilization is dead. Period. End of quote. Thank you.
Wow, excellent.
Thank you, Julio. I want to ask each one of you a different question, but before we do that, I want to let the author give some initial reflections about his book. And I'm going to do a very, very brief introduction that won't do justice to his many, many years in the struggle for democracy and human rights in Cuba. But I do want to highlight a couple of important aspects about him. Of course, born in Havana, Cuba. As Julio mentioned, he is an alum of FIU. He got his undergraduate and master's from FIU and then went over to the other side and got a PhD from UM. He has written 5 books. This is the most recent one of his books, but he has written 5 books, many, many articles. You see him on television all the time here in Miami, always fighting for human rights and for democracy in Cuba. He's the co-founder of the Cuban Democratic Directorio, which is one of the most respected organizations in the struggle for democracy in Cuba, and the coordinator of the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance, which is a coalition of pro-democracy organizations both inside and outside the island. For me, it's a real privilege to have you here discussing your book and hearing your thoughts about where we go next. So thank you, Orlando.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank all you for being here on a Monday night in FIU for this presentation. Thank you. It humbles me that you're all very busy people. Those who I know or those who I don't know, thank you for being here for this presentation. I want to thank Carlos Díaz-Rosillo for inviting me to be here. I love the title of this place, Adam Smith's Center for Economic Freedom. Adam Smith is such an important thinker. He has such an influence on me. And I think it's very courageous to set up a center in his name for everything his thinking entailed. I'm also very proud of Carlos Díaz-Rosillo. I'm proud that a young Cuban American has the kind of international respect he's got. Not only do I know of Carlos from his government service and his standing as a professor, but also internationally how he's respected. And that makes us all proud, so
thank you.
It's an honor to be here. Okay, I want to start. Quiero saludar a todos los que están aquí, que son expresos políticos cubanos. Hay muchos en la audiencia. Bajo eso incluyo a Johnny, que también estuvo, creo que fueron 3 años de prisión política después del desembarco. y quiero reconocer la presencia de dos personas que quiero mucho. Mario Miren de la Peña, su hijo Mario fue asesinado por el régimen comunista de Cuba en 1996 y está presente con nosotros todos los días. Así que gracias por estar aquí. Okay, now I'm going into English. When I began in this university, it seems to me like yesterday. To everybody here, it seems like a long time ago. 1984. There were 4 buildings and 17,000 students. And I'm so proud of how much FIU has grown. I got a degree in communications here. Then I began very early in my activism for a free Cuba. And when I got to school, I wanted my studies to help me not only get a job, because there was a big pressure on my generation to you study to get a job and succeed. We have very little time to play with college education. But I wanted also to understand better what I was fighting for. So I got my first degree in communications because I thought it was a skill I could use to pay the rent. But then I realized I didn't explain enough about who we were, what we were struggling against. And I got a bachelor's in political science. And then I thought, I'm going to work. I don't want to hear any more about school. School is very difficult. School is very intense. And there's a hidden reason why I invited this gentleman to be here with me and present it. I had this friend called Julio Shiling, and then he wouldn't let me go about getting a master's in political science. And every time I saw him, when did you get the master's? He talked me into getting the master's, and it was a great experience. I'm very thankful to you for that.
I enjoyed being with you.
Okay. And once I finished my master's, I was asked to teach here. I taught for 9 years, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I thank God for giving me that opportunity. And I had a great time teaching here at FIU. So it's a very special place to present my book. As I do so, I want to recall and remember an FIU professor who influenced my generation a great deal, Dr. Antonio Jorge. He passed by a few years ago. He passed away a few years ago, not passed by. And he was brilliant, and his classes were incredible. He was also a great professor in Cuba, but anyone who sat in one of his classes learned a great deal every time you sat down. Because this guy had this classical culture and this understanding of economics that touched each one of us. So I want to remember him as I speak here. One thing I realized as I went through my university courses was that I found, not in every case, there were exceptions, but mostly, there was a narrative about Cuba in my professors that was completely disengaged from the history of Cuba. I knew from Cuban, mostly exile historians, but also, moreover, from what my grandparents and parents had told me. And they weren't lying to me. They were passing on to me what they knew to be the truth. So I said, what's going on here? Why is there a clash? And my family comes from deep Cuba. When I say deep Cuba, I mean towns you've never heard of before, both in Oriente and in Pinar del Rio. And they've been in Cuba for a long time, and they had a living memory of the American occupation, of the War of Independence, of what happened. And I grew up listening to this. And I said, why is there such a big chasm between the narrative I get from most professors and what I know to be historical truth? And I think it has to do with a Cuban narrative that has prevailed in academia. And it's not necessarily a Marxist narrative, because I've known professors who had this Cuba narrative and they're not Marxists. But it's a narrative rooted in Marxism, rooted in a manipulation of Cuban history, which helps the regime in Cuba, which empowers the regime in Cuba, because it's the same narrative the regime uses. And I tried to find a way to struggle against the existence of this narrative. But to struggle against it, first you have to understand it better. So the purpose of the book, as I thought about the younger generation, and there are many younger than me, especially thought about my daughter, my stepkids who are going into college. And I said, well, totalitarianism in the 21st century is very different from what I knew totalitarianism to be. Right? It's completely different. Economically, it's different. Right? China is a communist state which has successfully used capitalism to become a world power. That is the truth. Right? Russia can no longer be called a communist economy, although they appear to be going back into that direction. But it's still either a heavily authoritarian or totalitarian state. So how do you explain totalitarianism to new generations who have grown up after the Cold War, who have grown up after somebody decided that totalitarianism was over because the Cold War had ended, which is another misconception. It has continued. And I said the best way to do so is to try and understand totalitarianism spiritually and psychologically, because that's an enduring part of human nature. That's transcendent. And totalitarianism has historically experimented with different economic systems. Lenin himself experimented with capitalism under something called the New Economic Program, which was the blueprint for what later on Deng Xiaoping did in China, but far more profoundly. But also because I think there are aspects of totalitarianism, the most important aspects that have to do with the moral and spiritual condition of humans. It's been grossly attributed to Marx that he said the economy ran everything. That's not exactly what he said. But what communists from Lenin on fully understood is that you dominate a society through control of its moral system. And I think Adam Smith's very important because Adam Smith, before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, what he wrote, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. That book impressed me so much. And he explained how morality, how the moral system is the basis of society. So totalitarianism is an effect to distort, control, manipulate what I believe to be the natural moral sense in human beings. And I think the first chapter is dedicated to that exploration of what totalitarianism is as an enduring phenomenon or as a virus. I think it's what I call an ontological virus. It's a parasite that affects knowledge and affects the most important kind of knowledge, which is moral knowledge. And at the basis of totalitarianism lies something called, another discovery I made, polylogism. I didn't discover it. Von Mises had discovered it. Hayek had written extensively on it, which is that for totalitarians, there's no truth and there's no lie. There's a power relationship. And whoever dominates and has power dominates language. Orwell makes a similar assertion in 1984. Probably Hobbes was the first one to say, you know, power is what determines language, power imposes definitions. And this view of what truth is and this view of what lies are, I think leads to two types of personalities that totalitarian states generate. One I will call the Gnostic. And there's a great Austrian-American professor, Eric Vogelin, who's become, I discovered him very late in life. And I gotta tell the story. I was 40 years old, I was a professor in FIU, and I knew everything. It was an incredible moment in my life. I thought I knew everything. And then I met a brother of Johnny called Amado Ayola, brother in arms. And Amado Ayola made me realize I didn't know anything about Vogelin. I had been turning the pages without understanding what this man was saying. And I began to study and try and reconceptualize what I understood about political science. So Vogelin says that totalitarianism is a modern religion. It's a worship of the state, which has its root in the Gnostic movement of the Middle Ages, which was a movement that neglected, that rejected the transcendent nature of man and emphasized that paradise would be achieved, it could be achieved on the earth itself. They call it the emancipation of the eschaton. It's a famous phrase by Vogelin. In other words, that human beings could recreate their own nature and their own world. That is the basic belief of many totalitarian leaders. Leon Trotsky. Trotsky famously wrote that he wanted to complete creation, that creation had been imperfect, right? There's a really good book called The Frankenstein novel. It's about this. It's about the anarchist idea, the socialist idea that humans could generate a new kind of human, right? And Mary Shelley realized from very early on the kind of horror this would produce. When you're watching Frankenstein, it's a political allegory about what a new human being created by human beings, what the monstrosity that would be. But I realized that totalitarian states not only generate Gnostics, and not only do Gnostics generate the totalitarian state, there's also another kind of figure, which is the sophist. And you remember who the sophists were. The sophists were the famous Greek teachers who taught that truth did not exist, that everything lay in the manipulation of words. There were many virtuous things about them, but they had this belief in the power of words. And the sophist is one who's maybe doesn't believe in utopia, maybe doesn't believe in recreating the world and recreating reality, but they're very much aware of where power lies and how power can be used to create a political basis that is enduring. The sophists eventually killed Socrates through a very complex process we all know. So I said, in the case of Cuba, who's the Gnostic, who's the sophist? And I became convinced Ernesto Guevara was the Gnostic, and Fidel Castro was the sophist. They both borrowed from each other. But I believe in all these totalitarian revolutions, there's somebody who calls power by its name, and there's someone else who initially believes in all the objectives of this so-called revolution. And the sophist generally uses the Gnostic to destroy the old order and then dispenses with them. It happens over and over again in every single totalitarian revolution. And I had this suspicion about Ernesto Guevara. I don't call him Che because I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's humorous. I think he was a terrible human being, and I don't want to be intimate with someone like that. And my wife found a very, very interesting recording of a conversation that Che Guevara had in 1964, called him Che, Ernesto Guevara had in 1964 with a group of left-wing intellectuals and journalists in the Cuban mission to the UN after he gave his famous UN speech where he promised to continue to execute people in Cuba no matter what. And it was interesting to me because I had read some of his stuff, I had heard his speeches, I had never heard him in a conversation. And it became clear to me that at the root of it all, throughout the conversation, and it's interesting because in the conversation, it begins with Guevara thinking that he's a Socrates and he has disciples and he's teaching them about revolution and how to do it. And then I realized that these people sitting in front of Che are also Che again. These people sitting in front of Guevara are using him and molding him towards what they want. The role they think Guevara and Cuba have to play in what they're trying to accomplish. And Guevara, there are moments when he can't explain what they're about. He's out of words. And then he keeps referring over and over again to madness. And madness being the salvation of the world. And madness being what really happened in Cuba. And madness being the only future humanity had. And madness ties in to this Gnostic idea, 100%. That the defiance of reason is the path to salvation. So I said, what did this guy really believe in? And what I try to do in the book is go deeply into Guevara's thought. And I think deep down what they believed in was not Marx. Marx was an instrument they used, was not Lenin. They believed in a profound civilizational decay. They believed that the Western civilization would disappear, was crumbling. And that if the central figure of Western civilization had been the individual, the central figure of the new civilization would be the mass. And you see this in his diaries. You see this when he was writing as a young man. And then I realized that I found in his narrative is completely Nietzschean. It's completely influenced by fascism and Nazism. And I put it here, I quote directly. And he talks about this European stranger he meets on his famous motorcycle tour that tells him that all civilization will crumble, that he will fight for that new civilization, and then the mass will also consume him. This European stranger tells him what will happen to him. And then I thought a bit more and said, who were the European strangers walking around South America in the 1950s? Who were Guevara says, the European stranger who came from persecution and came from the fleeing from dogma, who had gone through violence. Who were those people? The Nazis. There were 30,000 Nazis in South America in the 1950s, especially Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay. I am convinced that Che Guevara ran into these Nazis, and they greatly influenced his view, because in his mind, Nazism, Marxism are different types of socialism. They're different types of ideologies that will replace the classical Western individual who will crumble, who will fall apart. That civilization is dying. He's convinced of this. So this idea is deep-seated in them. So was he fighting for a better Cuba? No. He was fighting, as he clearly states, to create a platform from which to attack the United States and to destroy the great bastion of that Western civilization. So I think the other key thing is Guevara clearly states, and Castro was the sophist. He was very smart about how he said things, but their program's the same. Guevara was very clear about what he wanted to do, and one of the things which I found over and over again is his reference to, we're going to destroy the Cuban individual as he has been known, or she has been known unto the present moment. And they're going to be replaced by something called la masa, the mass. He doesn't hide it. He's saying it very clearly. I can tell you where he says it. And then when he describes the mass, and he describes, I urge you to read Man and Socialism in Cuba. Read how Ernesto Guevara describes a Fidel Castro speech. And you got him there. he describes this mystical bonding and vibration between the great leader and the mass, and they act as a single unit. And then you know what I did? I went and I knew I had read that somewhere. So I went and I found a description of a Hitler speech. And it's almost the same words. So let's be clear, when people put the Che Guevara on there, what they're putting on their chest. The kind of evil that was inside that mind. Did they use Marxism to make it more palatable? Yeah, they did. But there was no love there for your fellow human being. There's no love there for Cuba. There's no love there for a better. There's this vision of civilizational destruction and a new civilization coming that will win because of force and numbers. How did they create totalitarianism? How did they really structure it? And I think I found the answer in the agrarian reform. I won't go into everything here, but I think the regime used agrarian reform as the excuse to create the National Institute for Agrarian Reform and something else called Acopio. And those two institutions were where Castro began to create the totalitarian state. He couldn't do it at first because he had to be part of a coalition government where there were democratic forces participating, but then he was creating this here, this totalitarian state that eventually usurped all the institutions. And lastly, you also have to understand this when I began to study it. From 1954 on, the Soviet Union was slowly democratizing. Khrushchev had revealed Stalin's crimes. The 1956 invasion of Hungary had completely shamed communism internationally. It was the Soviet Union was in a state of moral bankruptcy. And along comes the Cuban Revolution, its imagery very well constructed, and it's seen as this group of young idealists who are creating a new democratic order. And the revolution in Cuba, this new totalitarian state, renews the face of the Soviet Union before the rest of the world, especially the Third World. But we have to understand Fidel Castro, Guevara, they were critical of what was going on in the Soviet Union. It's not that they longed for Stalin. They longed for that kind of state, and they weren't hiding it. They see Khrushchev as somebody who's going too much in the direction of the U.S. And I think they insist on a confrontation with the United States for their own reasons, but also to force the Soviet Union into a more radical stance. And I think the documents that were revealed last month about the secret conversations between Raul Castro and Nikita Khrushchev in 1960 in Moscow, they clearly indicate everything I put in the book without having seen that. So there's a really sinister goal, overarching international goal in this regime. And also, it's quick alliance with totalitarianism wherever they could find it. I urge you to read the transcript of the conversation between Mao Zedong and Ernesto Guevara. I've been brainwashed. In Beijing in 1960. And read these two psychopaths talking about the future of nations. And frankly, in the transcript, Mao seems to be a lot saner than Guevara. When you read this. Guevara didn't have the power Mao had. But when you realize what these people say, and there's a part where I had to mention before finishing, and so you understand what happened in Cuba. What happened in Cuba was an international occupation disguised as a national revolution. And there's a part at the beginning where Mao says, Dr. Guevara, your entire delegation is not Cuban. You're all from different Latin American countries. There's only one Cuban among you. Don't you think the Cuban people will mind this? And Guevara responds, no, we're all internationalists, we're all Cubans, because there are no Cubans in the meeting with Mao. It didn't matter. They weren't creating a Cuban state. They were creating a communist state, a totalitarian state. And if they had to ally themselves with totalitarianism from the right or the left, it didn't matter. It was to create a platform to attack the US and subordinate the Cuban people. I found that these destructive and parasitic ideas, this ontological virus, inevitably affects the life of a nation. It kills nations. And I think, again, you go to the agrarian reform and what happened with Cuban food production from 1959 onward. By 1959, Cuba had achieved, with all the political problems, it had achieved two impressive things. 70% of Cuban farmers had some kind of land under their possession. Even Guevara admits this. He said, Cuban farmers have land. Right? It's the only Latin American country that had that high of a percentage of control of land by farmers. Number two, by 1955, I think it's 1955, 56, Cuba, 85% of what Cubans ate came from Cuba. That's a major accomplishment for a country that's developing. Carlos is the expert on development here. Cubans fed themselves and then they exported food. Today, Cuba imports 85% of what it eats from the United States and Canada. The Cuban countryside was ravaged by Castro's so-called agrarian reform. The country lost the ability to feed itself. Why did they do that? And the more I read, the more I become convinced it was programmatic. I found a great book by Manuel Artime, a historic, one of the leaders of the brigade, where he said everything that was going to happen. He was part of the agrarian reform. He saw what they were doing. He said it's going to become a very hungry nation. Was reform needed in the Cuban countryside? Yes. They needed roads, needed doctors, needed schools. Did you need to take away their freedom of all Cubans to do that? No, no one thought that. But I think that what they did was they wanted to control Cuban agriculture, to control the cities. Castro was very much aware. Castro wasn't sure of the support he had in the cities. Remember, there were 3 million people in Oriente by 1959 in eastern Cuba, and the rebel army didn't have 1,000 fighters. Right? Maybe they had 10,000 other fighters still. The majority of people in Oriente did not join that effort. And he was very afraid of the cities because there had been no major demonstration, no major strikes in support of what he was trying to do. That doesn't mean that Batista had support. It just means that a lot of Cubans were unsure about this man yet. So he was very much aware of the fact that he needed to control the countryside, to control the cities, to crush the middle class. And I found a speech where he's telling the middle class exactly what he's going to do to them. Cuba had one of the largest middle classes in Latin America. And Castro knew he had to crush that middle class. So I think the importance of this book, whatever it may contribute, is to understand what's happening now in our country, what's happening in the US, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Latin America. I think totalitarian ideas are parasitic ideas. They're highly destructive. They come from a twisted view of human nature. And nowhere where they have been implemented has there been a better order created. It's always led to a downward spiral for people. So I apologize for extending myself. Thank you for the opportunity, and that's my presentation.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask just one question of each of our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. I want to have plenty of time for questions from the audience so we can have this as a conversation, not just a monologue from each one of us. Leonardo, I'll begin with you. I think it's really important to have you here, not only because of the great work that you've done at CESCOS, but also because as a non-Cuban, you understand really that what happens in Cuba doesn't stay in Cuba, and that it really matters to Latin America and to other countries around the world. And so, as a non-Cuban, why should a non-Cuban really pick up this book and understand its implications to Uruguay, to Colombia, to all the Latin American countries that many of them are facing very similar issues to what Cuba was facing in 1959? En español lo puedes hacer.
Sí, el tema de, como dije en las breves palabras que mencioné, en Uruguay vivimos en una democracia plena, con plenas libertades y plenos derechos. Y eso muchas veces nos hace creer que eso es para siempre y que eso, bueno, ya lo tenemos y por lo tanto nos pertenece, y nos damos el lujo muchas veces, algunos de mis compatriotas en Uruguay y algunos sectores políticos que incluso llegaron al gobierno y gobernaron, por ejemplo, los 15 años anteriores, se dan el lujo de decir que en Cuba todavía existe una revolución y que hay sueños por cumplir y que en realidad ese es un régimen que está lleno de esperanza o que lleva esperanza. Y la lectura de este libro, de este tipo de trabajos, le hace ver, no, en todo caso no tanto a mí, que estoy ya más vinculado, pero en todo caso le hace ver a quienes no viven en Cuba o quienes viven en el resto de América Latina o que tienen la suerte de vivir en libertad, incluso seguramente para muchos norteamericanos que han vivido siempre en libertad, con libertad de expresión, etcétera, que eso no es para siempre y que eso hay que cuidarlo todo el tiempo. Y que siempre los relatos que se construyen a partir de sueños y de grandes promesas de un hombre feliz o un hombre nuevo, lo que fuera que prometen este tipo de regímenes totalitarios, hay que leerlos con cuidado y hay que estudiarlos con cuidado para no cometer el error, para no creer ese discurso y para no cometer el error de tentarse con este tipo de régimen. Yo creo que este tipo de obras, la de Orlando, pero todas las que vayan en este sentido, tienen ese valor para quienes no somos cubanos y para quienes, pero sobre todo y más que nada, para quienes tenemos la suerte de vivir en libertad. Por eso yo lo mencionaba, cuanto más en libertad vivamos, más tenemos que saber estas cosas para evitar que nos pase.
Así es. And that's one of the reasons why, just a parenthesis, why the center is about to launch a roadshow, if you will, with the help of Frank, who's over here. We call it Freedom Matters. We want to take this idea to different parts of Latin America to show that, again, what happens in Cuba doesn't stay in Cuba, and Cuba is really the head of this monster that has spread throughout the hemisphere. So our goal is to take this story and show it, not in Miami. It's very important to talk about it in Miami, but we often only talk about it to people who already agree with us. Take it to different capitals throughout the world so that people realize that what happened in Cuba could very well happen, and it's happening already, in different parts of the hemisphere. Julio, you said something I think is incredibly important. You talked about policy, and I care deeply about that connection between theory and practice, and you mentioned public policy. From your perspective, if you're a policymaker, whether it's at the National Security Council or in the State Department, what policy lessons do you think we can learn from this book so that we don't make the mistakes that I think we've been making in the United States for far too long? Not just in the case of Cuba, but in other Latin American countries. If you had to highlight a couple of policy implications that are evident from the book. It's not a policy book, but I think it has important policy implications. What would those be?
You know, Carlos, I want to first begin, if I may, with the idea that you just mentioned about doing a traveling freedom tour. It is so important because you cannot explain what's happened in Chile, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Peru without the Cuban dictatorship.
Yep.
It would not have happened. Cuban intelligence is responsible for the mobilization, for the finance of all this. It's done with drug money. It's done with outside rogue actors like the Iranian regime, like China, like Syria. So, you cannot, I mean, if anybody thinks they're safe, they know nothing about geopolitics. And it's ironic that Communist Cuba has done this since 1959, yet they did not have a success story. Why? Because they were challenged head-on by force, and they were defeated. I mean, you had Nicaragua, you had Grenada, you had Chile, all these were overturned. Yet since the fall of Soviet communism, and Orlando touched upon this in his book, the emphasis of the West won the Cold War and they lost the peace because they emphasized on the economy as if this was an economic problem, and it wasn't. It was a moral problem. It was a problem a systemic problem, and the West did not capitalize on that. So the fact that you're going to take this on is crucial. Partners like Leonardo are fundamental, and I think you're going to find a lot more receptive people now because they're feeling it. I mean, it's not just, hey, these crazy Cubans are telling us that everybody's a communist. Now, like, they're saying, hey, we got them in our backyard, so it's important. Now, what would I do? Well, if I was in the State Department, I'd have an exorcism and basically, get out, because the State Department has been one of the pillars of evil infiltration by the Soviet Union and by, in this case, because Communist Cuba has sort of assumed the role of the Soviet Union in the Western Hemisphere, using Venezuela's oil, drug money. They're using everybody else's money to sort of give the orders, and in essence, they rescued a face of communism, which mutated into a different model. The Chinese, remember 6 months before or 5 months before the Berlin Wall, you had the Tiananmen Square massacre, which sort of consolidated the China model. You can have a Leninist state with a hybrid, capitalist system and state capitalist system, and that's been functioning unfortunately well in China, Vietnam, Laos. The only reason Cuba doesn't go that way is because of the Cuban nation outside its territory. But I think, unfortunately, and again, Orlando touches on this in his book, the West has lost the focus with the fall of communism because of the fact that you have a model that simulates being democratic, because they have voting sessions which are totally rigged, they're controlled. They have an opposition that is irrelevant. I'm talking Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. And the only reason why they did not win in Ecuador and in Brazil was because you had the armed forces were not penetrated. You had in Brazil Jair Bolsonaro as military intelligence. They knew very well exactly what Cuban intelligence was up to. And in Ecuador, the military told Correa, you move more, we're taking you out. We're not going to allow this. So I think that, unfortunately, Carlos, there isn't, I don't see a will at this point. That's not to say that at some moment there could be. I think the drug trafficking is crucial. It impacts U.S. national security. I think that's where they need to look at. They need to say, you know, this is obvious. I mean, if drug deaths are the major cause of death for American males between the age of 18 and 45, and it's coming through the southern border, you know, I mean, you don't have to be a brain scientist to understand that they've got to be taken out. But the moral argument, and I think Orlando dedicates a lot of time to that, is crucial. I mean, these movements think that this is all you've got. That this is, you know, they're trying to make heaven on earth. That's it. It's not a coincidence that they're all atheists. There's no notion of a transcendental order. And that's important. That's important because if you want to have a democratic system, you need to have a virtuous society. You need to have a citizenry that, you know, sort of behaves decent. And these regimes, because of the counterculture, promote totally the opposite. Which means that, you know, systems bring out the best and worst of people. But this is why, and I'll close, and I hope I've answered your question. It's important because public opinion is moved by work such as this and by confronting individuals that are really pseudo intellectuals that are just pulling the line for, you know, totalitarian regimes, other despotic entities that need to be confronted with the facts, because that's, you know, you don't have to be a great debater to really, you just have to have the will and not be afraid of, well, will I be ostracized? Will they, you know, will such department just throw me out and you know, put me in a back corner? No, you've got to, you know, make an investment and have the will. Otherwise, like, you know, Oriana Valachi said, you know, we're dead.
One question for Orlando, and it's a version of a question I had an opportunity to ask Vice President Mike Pence when he came on Friday, and I'm going to change it a little bit. Your book does a great job talking about the myth-building nature of this regime in Cuba, and what a great job they've done over the years romanticizing the revolution. And I asked Vice President Pence the following. Right now at universities across the country, you say communism, you say socialism, and young people think it's romantic, it's exotic. But you say capitalism, it's almost a bad word. And so we got to change the narrative. And I always say democracy is not perfect. Capitalism is far from perfect, but they're the best systems we have to organize our political life and our economic life. Briefly, if you can come up with one recommendation to help change that narrative so that people begin to realize really what this system is all about, what communism is all about, and what the alternative is. What would that be? What would be that one recommendation so we can begin to change the narrative, not just here, but around the world?
I think you need an entire reform of how social science is taught at the university level and the high school level. I think that the only purpose social science has is to describe reality. If it's not doing that, it's worthless. And what the 20th century and the 21st century have taught us is that democratic rule usually goes with economic success. Chile, upon achieving democracy, it took off. Botswana, upon achieving independent rules-based democracy, it took off economically. Taiwan, upon achieving democracy, another economic success. I can go on listing them. Poland, Czech Republic. That is the real story of the 20th and the 21st centuries. You don't find that. I think you need educational reform. To me, it's ridiculous that so many of us who have gone to the Florida public school system were never taught geography. I used to teach a course here that I really enjoyed, Ancient to Medieval Political Theory. I found I had to spend the first 2 weeks explaining what the Mediterranean was, because our kids had not been taught that. And what you're doing is generating citizens who don't understand the basic functions of an economy. And I think economy has to be taught a lot better. Economics is fascinating, but it's taught in a way it really causes a rejection in students. Economy is a fascinating science when you understand it as the science that studies decision-making by individuals. When I thought, I hate math, and I thought, sorry, I have a great math professor here. I hate math, and I thought economics is math. And then I read a great book that introduced me to economics as the science of understanding the aggregate of human decision-making. That turned it off. Wow, that's what economics does. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to reform from the base how you teach economics. Because what happens is, I'm not denigrating anyone, just saying what's going on to us. I think more and more of our youth could not read the Wall Street Journal because the information contained has not been explained to students. What is NASDAQ? How does Wall Street really work? What does a stock mean? What does it entail for you? How does currency work? Mm-hmm. Why you're not going to generate more wealth by printing more money? Mm-hmm. That isn't being taught.
So education.
So I think my basic policy would be, one, education, and two, that our private sector has to put a lot more resources into explain to the rest of the country why it's profitable for all of us.
And why it works.
I want to say something very briefly in Spanish. Yo también escribí este libro como parte de un esfuerzo para contribuir a que los cubanos puedan recuperar su propia historia. La nación cubana la despojaron de su historia bajo este régimen. A los cubanos le han alimentado una historia que no es la historia de Cuba. Es una historia que justifica la presencia de una tiranía totalitaria en Cuba. Y el ignorar nuestra propia historia nos conduce a perder la fe en nosotros mismos como individuos y como ciudadanos. Y hay una historia tan importante que contar sobre Cuba. El milagro económico cubano de 1902 a 1959. Esos primeros 20 años brillantes que tuvo la República de crecimiento económico e igualdad social. Las dos cosas ocurrieron. Me enteré de eso porque uno comienza a investigar, porque la narrativa comunista también ha infiltrado nuestra fila. Y la visión de la República también ha infiltrado nuestra fila. La fila de los que queremos libertad. Y si no tenemos una comprensión completa, cabal, de la historia de Cuba, entonces Cuba no va a poder recuperar su soberanía. Y creo que espero con este libro hacer una contribución a esa reconquista de la historia de Cuba por parte de los cubanos.
All right. We get a button. So I want to spend about 20 minutes Q&A, so if you have a question, just raise your hand, let us know who you are, and remember that questions end in a question mark. Yes?
Since I was born in Cuba, I would like to give you something that you can hang your hat on since you're a student. Castro decided, let's freeze all rents. Who the hell gave Castro the right to freeze the income, the private income of people? And then everybody applauded. People live in the houses in Cuba. They don't know if they belong to them or to the state. And in your own country, in the US, you go to rent control in New York City, Miami-Dade County is a very socialist government where in 1958, the buses in Miami were private. And now the buses belong to the government with a huge bureaucracy. And the purpose supposedly was to improve transit. Most of what you hear about Cuba is the terrible things that happen to political prisoners. But abortions in Cuba, that's the first thing Castro did. Cuba does not produce enough Cubans for its population because abortion for everybody. First speech by Castro. Guns, what for? Collecting all the guns. Second speech. Elections, what for? You guys have the blessing of the Second Amendment, and you have the blessing of all the other 10 amendments. So in Frank Zimmerman's Freedom Matters campaign, there's a lot you can tie between the U.S. and our warning to Latin America, because the American students don't pause to think, why should there be rent control, etc., etc. Since we're being in the Adam Smith Center, this is a one example that I wanted to bring to you, because I left my country when I was 12, and I have a good comparison of your education, which was mine, and my education before. I was a Peter Pan kid. Left Cuba without my parents. Ended up in Libby, Montana, population 2,000. And my appreciation for the Adam Smith, the first time I heard about the invisible hand in my first year, University of Miami economics course, always stayed with me. So that's what I wanted to say. We're going to hear a lot about the terrible totalitarian system from the political side. It's even worse from the economic side.
Right. Question. Yes.
My question, I would like to pose it for you, Dr. Orlando Gutiérrez, as well as you, Shiling. What advice could you give to an individual, especially young individuals, to protect themselves from this kind of state manipulation? Specifically, what tactics do you think the state use psychologically and particularly to manipulate the individual, make the individual vulnerable in a general sense to their manipulation and pretty much selling the individual to the state? What is some advice to protect us against that kind of manipulation?
I'll tell you what I think. God, religion is very important. Understand the coherence of creation of the universe. Value your personal freedom, and a document that everyone should read and reread until they understand it, called Federalist Number 10. I read Federalist Number 10 for the first time when I was a freshman here. I didn't understand it. It took me to senior year to understand the deep truths in that very, very reduced essay about the nature of free government. Y lo que estoy diciendo es que es importante para fortalecer al individuo, a la persona, Dios, la religión, el derecho natural. Y es un documento muy importante que yo recomendaría para que quieran comprender lo que es una república, Federalista número 10, que es una explicación sucinta pero profunda de lo que es un gobierno libre y del gran experimento que se hizo en Estados Unidos y lo exitoso que ha sido ese experimento. Yo creo que es muy importante comprender Federalist Number 10 y creo que lamentablemente se habla muy poco de ese Federalista número 10 y el impacto que tiene para lo que estamos viviendo ahora.
And it also talks a lot about the importance of what factions can do in a society. Very, very important.
I think that a state has a certain level of power, and obviously, if abused, it can do an enormous damage. But, a free society, in other words, a society that's able to choose its leaders, depends on a whole host of preconditions. Do we all have access to information? Is the press free? And censorship can come not just from government, but also private entities. So it's important for all these things to stay, focused. But when we look at, and when we say, well, the United States is the most successful, democracy in the world, well, there's a reason for that. The Republican system in the U.S. was biblically based. In other words, there was an understanding that in the concept of original sin, in the sense that humans are imperfect. So if humans are imperfect, then imagine humans with power in a government. Boy, that can be dangerous. So what do? You need to develop a system that's going to limit power in the government, which is why you have checks and balances, which is why you have separation of powers, which you have a private sector that is supposedly balancing all these actors out because of the dangers of that absolute. But the underlying notion, it really is the belief in a transcendental order, the belief that as imperfect as we are in this life, we must behave decently, otherwise the system is not gonna work. And I think this needs to be re-emphasized on an educational level from the civic classes, because democracy and the Republican system can't be taken for granted. I think that is enormously dangerous because you can keep voting until eventually you'll vote in demagogues that will think for you because society can't be trusted anymore. So it is the path to, you know, an authoritarian system. And I think even here in the US, you know, we see private entities censor speech, censor thought, not just in social media, but on the internet. This is terribly dangerous.
Absolutely.
Terribly dangerous because it distorts reality. In other words, you know, if you, I mean, if our founding fathers had believed, well, if I put in a little machine, what is this? I'm going to get the view, the ideological view of whoever owns that system. I mean, I think we have to reinvent the system to what we're living at now, and liberty and the defense of liberty is, you know, a priority. Otherwise, we will cease to be a free society.
And when you say Republican system, you're not speaking of the Republican Party, but
No,
you're
no, exactly.
the actual Republican
Exactly.
of respecting Republican.
Right. I mean, you know, the U.S. is a constitutional
Right.
republic that exercises democracy. You know,
Exactly.
not the Greek stuff, that direct democracy, which is a myth. Total, you know.
Understood. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, back there.
So, thank you for the presentation. It was excellent. The Cuban government, throughout these years, has actually succeeded in basically scaring the crap out of people and alienating everyone, or the vast majority of individuals, away from the nation of Cuba. And folks have to leave the island in order to recreate the concept of nationality. Having said that, the perspective that is taken, and I think the big challenge, and here's my question for Dr. Gutierrez. There's a French philosopher, a historian, Renan, that he talked about the daily plebiscite of the individual and the involvement of the individual in the day-to-day affairs of their country. Now, if you alienate individuals by force, by the dogma created in the system, how is it that you can, in the future, because everybody knows, I think that it's been beat over that worse, that Cuba is a failed state. I mean, it's out there. But how do you re-engage individuals into have them buy into the idea of a new Cuba? How do you re-engage individuals within the island, which are the ones that are, let's be honest, are they going to be the ones that are going to take up the baton and continue with a mess that they're going to find themselves? How do you re-engage them? And where does the economy fit into all of this to create a new step or a new chapter in the nation of Cuba?
Today I had lunch with a guy who arrived in Cuba on a raft 20 years ago. And today he's a millionaire through very hard work. And there's more than one. And he was telling us a story of how he made his money, how he worked, and he's very proud of being Cuban. So I wanted to give you that anecdote because what I want to say is, and you're also a very hardworking guy. And you've lifted up what you've done through very, very hard work. That's part of our culture. When Cubans once again associate freedom with being Cuban, the explosion of prosperity and industry will be unprecedented. Cubans have to associate once again nationality with the positive creative forces of freedom. And that's the main obligation any government has that will replace the dictatorship. Return sovereignty to the people, return freedom to the people. Will it be perfect? No, we don't want perfection, we want reality. But if you have a rules-based, transparent order where people know what can happen tomorrow and the power of the state is limited and people can organize and work and what they do regains value once again, Cubans have shown all over the world what they can do when they live in their freedom. And Cuban exile colonies throughout the world, communities are successful. Cuba is the place where Cubans are unsuccessful because their nature is stifled. So yo creo que la forma en que Cuba pueda prosperar de nuevo, Jorge, es que la nacionalidad vuelva a estar vinculada con la libertad. Y eso no es difícil porque ahí está la naturaleza de ser cubano. Está en nuestra historia fundamentalmente, medularmente. El régimen no ha podido arrancar a José Martí la historia de Cuba porque desaparece Cuba, se le quita a José Martí o a Varela o a las guerras de independencia. ¿Y por qué fue todo ese movimiento? Por la libertad personal. Martí wasn't a nationalist. He wasn't a statist. He wanted personal freedom. In fact, you read Martí, you read Maceo. Antonio Maceo would have been a trustee here at the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. Maceo believes in laissez-faire capitalism because that's the only way that he believes that there can be liberty and equality. If people can really build and have private property and grow. That's understudied. We have to understand and learn that. By the way, the other day I learned that Antonio Maceo's grandson and great-grandson were part of Brigade 2506 at the Bay of Pigs. I wish more people knew that because that tells you a lot about what happened. The only other thing I want to add, and it's very quick, I taught world history for a long time. It's a field I really enjoy. Every major civilization reaches a point in its development where it requires a great effort to maintain a civilization, a great daily effort. And this can exhaust the civilization. So there's a period in every major civilization where they begin to worship death because they're tired, they're exhausted. They believe that there's too much weight on them. Usually major civilizations climb out of this. They're re-energized and they once again build. For example, in Egypt, when you go from the old kingdom to the new kingdom, you see how the god of death gains prominence because civilization was becoming tired. This is not predetermined. This happens, but it can be overcome. And I think the reason why the Guevara icon is an icon, the reason why so many young people are into that, it's because it's a death symbol. It's a representation of the exhaustion of our civilization and the stress that it takes to be free. Freedom is not liberation from stress. It's more stress because you have to take responsibility and you have to decide. But that is liberating. That is a way of becoming a better human being. So I think that it's important that these ideologies and these symbols, they don't represent a new kind of freedom. They don't represent equality. They represent destruction of a system which may not be perfect, but has generated an improvement in human living conditions unprecedented in history.
A question? Anybody? No? Anybody? So a hand. Yep, go for it.
Hi, my name is Leonardo Martín. I'm a student here at FIU and I'm also in the student government. I'm a senator for my college. And my question to you is, what can we do about this ideology affecting our university and affecting our education system? I'd like to give you just a little bit of background. In my first year at FIU, one of my professors told me that in order to explain why he believed his reasons, that I should read Che Guevara and he recommended one of his books. And I told him, I'm Cuban, at least I'm part Cuban, I have Cuban heritage. And I told him, I'm a little bit of that. And what he told me is just don't tell abuela. That's what he said.
What did you say? What?
Don't tell abuela.
Which is, my abuela isn't even a Cuban one, which is but, aside from that, in Senate, which is now the students, right? I, along with some other senators, I created a bill to recognize victims of communism, which a lot of students at this university are victims of communism, and I wanted to create a holiday for them, not a holiday of a day off, but just a day of recognition for them. That bill passed only by a slim margin. I think that it was 18 in favor, 14 not in favor. So, some people like to say communism is here at our doorstep. But I don't think it's at our doorstep. I think it's in our house. It's an infection in our walls. Mm-hmm. So what do we do about that? What can I do about that?
Okay, first of all, congratulations on sponsoring that. I think the reason the professor said, don't tell abuela, is because he knows that our grandparents, great-grandparents, and parents gave us truth. The Cuban family is a fundamental unit in our culture. It's based on love and it's based on truth. Usually parents don't lie to their kids and grandparents don't lie to their grandchildren. That we seek truth. I'm very glad my grandparents told me the truth. My grandmother, when she told me, there was stuff she told me that said, I thought this woman knows nothing about history and politics. I know everything. She's a piano teacher, and what can she know? The older I grow, the more I see how smart my grandmother was, and the truth she knew because she lived it. She saw it. For example, she told me the American occupation of Cuba was highly successful. I said, that can't be. Even though I'm anti-Castro, the imperialist, no, it was highly successful. The U.S. did a great job of nation building in Cuba between 1898 and 1902. So where do you start? I think that, number one, stand your ground. Stand your ground for what you know is true. But that requires you doing your own research and your own reading. They want you to read Ernesto Guevara, read him critically. One thing I found reading this guy, Guevara, how he despised what he found in Cuba. When he's going from eastern Cuba to central Cuba, Castro sends him, and they bribe their way there, no major military feat. As he's going there, he can't explain Cuban wealth. He can't explain the prosperity he finds. So he has all these things. Well, in this country you have so many radio stations and TV stations, but there's poverty back in eastern